Welcome back to the Zero Powerlifting Podcast. Very special announcement. We're now sponsored by Establishment Coffee. You can go to establishmentcoffee.com.au, use the code 025 for 25% off and free shipping on any of their coffee. Check them out. They're right next door to the gym here. They make coffee for us all the time and they are fantastic. So establishmentcoffee.com.au, use the code 025, that's 0 with a W, for 25% off and free shipping. Another powerlifting podcast, Zero Powerlifting Podcast. Today's topic has been suggested by a handsome young member of mine, young Bjorn, and he suggested the topic of intensifying techniques. That is, things to ramp up the intensity of training. Think drop sets, supersets, think Amraps, think anything that is going to add difficulty, add intensity without necessarily just increasing load. In fact, it might involve decreasing load. There's a bit more to this than meets the eye. I think that one thing that many powerlifters, including myself in my own lifting career, if you could call it that, are guilty of is getting used to the idea that training for strength involves a lot of submax training. Very rarely are we going to failure. Very rarely are we going even close to the point of failure. We're capping the intensity to allow us to continue to build momentum all the time. And that tends to then creep into our whole training mindset. We tend to take that then to smaller accessories or assistance exercises that might garner a lot of value if we increase the intensity of them rather than keeping them capped. And so I'm not saying that we need to go balls to the wall on everything all the time, but there is going to be a time and a place, and there's going to be a value to using these intensifying techniques to add more intensity to training overall. Very rarely are we going to see that value applied to the main lift, applied to a squat, bench, deadlift for a powerlifter. Sometimes we might use this technique, whether it's adding some interest or some fun for someone who's newer. There's something to be said for healthy competition in terms of something like an Amrap, for example, on a bench press with body weight or something like that. There is times and places where we could justify them for a softer reason, but from a pure training perspective, in terms of like just return on investment, very rarely, if ever, are we going to use them for squat, bench, deadlift. Where they're going to start to come in handy is in accessory work, especially as we get more and more isolated and look at training smaller muscles that we can afford to train closer to failure or even right to failure. For purposes of whether it's conditioning, hypertrophy, whatever we may be using these techniques for, there's going to be certain value that we can ascribe to these techniques. So some of the reasons you might use these, one thing that is the worst powerlifting excuse that you ever hear is like, oh, my sessions take 3 hours. It takes me 3 hours to get through a session. You don't train for 3 hours. You're at the gym for 3 hours. If a training session is taking you 3 hours to get through, that says to us that you're probably just being slow. And there is going to be some incentive for delaying the rest period in the main lift, especially as the intensity of the main lift continues to go up. But most of the time, if you're resting for more than like 3 to 5 minutes for the main lift, you're probably just deconditioned. So when it comes to decreasing the length of a session, we can use some of these techniques to ramp the intensity up and make the accessory training faster. We can use shorter rest periods. We can use supersets. We can use trisets. We can use drop sets to ramp up the intensity of these accessory exercises, depending on the purpose, to speed up a session. We can use them to add value in terms of just being fun. Like, it's fun to chase a pump. If you've been doing powerlifting style training and you've adopted this mindset of sort of a capped intensity all the time, you kind of forget what it feels like to train hard, to walk away from the gym feeling pumped, to get that burn, to feel like, your legs are shaking or you can't lift up your arms because your arms and shoulders and chest are so pumped. You kind of forget that feeling. And for a lot of us, we kept coming back to the gym because of that feeling. And returning to experiencing that feeling can kind of reignite some passion. I experienced this, personally, I experienced this earlier this year. For the first time in ages, I switched my training style while I was trying to lose a bunch of weight. I did a lot of drop sets. I did controlled rest periods. I never rested more than a minute and a half for like 3 months on any of the lifts, including the main lifts. Each session was really quick. Each session left me sweating and huffing and puffing. Each session got me a mad pump, and it felt good. Like it was a return to sort of how I used to train in the gym, which was just way too hard all the time, but in a controlled and intelligent way this time around. And sometimes experiencing that spark, that nostalgia around like what training was for us in the early days, what it meant for us, what we did it for, just to chase a pump and to feel good, kind of adds some incentive to train like that, and add some incentive to push again in the gym. It reignites a passion that you once had, and it can be really valuable in that sense. It can be good for modulating intensity, that is for making the weights that are lower feel relatively harder, which you can use for a number of purposes. You can use to fatigue the muscle, especially if you're, again, doing the low-level isolation exercises. You can do this to work around particular issues that you may have. So, for example, if you're experiencing some tendinopathy around the tricep tendinopathy or quad tendinopathy, you might see value in adding a whole bunch of tempo to something like a leg extension and tricep push down to be able to complete that session or that exercise to get the intended purpose out of it and to benefit rehab as well. So there are times and places where you're going to use these methods, and I think it's important that we don't just write them off completely. While it's not necessarily an intensifying technique, something like an Amrap is valuable to talk about here as well. So if you think about an Amrap and what an Amrap is, an Amrap and a 1 rep max are the same thing. If you're doing as many reps as you can do, and on the last rep you fail, theoretically at that point in time you've exceeded your 1 rep max. So if you do 10 reps and you fail the 11th, at that point in time your 10th rep was your 1 rep max. And so like the reason we don't do 1 rep maxes every single week is because we know we can't then generate enough volume, we can't stimulate enough breaking of adaptation to continue to drive strength adaptations or hypertrophy adaptations. So we don't do 1 rep maxes every week, and as such we shouldn't do AMRAPs every week. We just shouldn't do that. And a lot of people will still program AMRAPs every week thinking that it might have some sort of strength or hypertrophy benefit. So from a pure training value standpoint, again, return on investment, not a lot of value. However, AMRAPs are really fun. Like we used to have this challenge in the gym, it wasn't a real challenge, it was just, among some of the boys, where on a shoulder day, we'd do an AMRAP 60 kilo incline bench press. And it was just a great deal of fun. And we'd do it every couple of weeks just to see, breed some healthy competition and have some fun. It didn't detract from training because we weren't doing it frequently or intensely enough to detract from training. It didn't add any real value to training besides some camaraderie, besides some friendship, besides some healthy competition. And there is value in that stuff. Like it keeps some passion ignited. It breeds some competition. It breeds some grit. Doing an AMRAP really breeds grit. When you really go to failure, you know what failure feels like. You know what muscular failure feels like. You know what breaking mental barriers feels like. There is value in this stuff. It's just about working out how do we as coaches know when to prescribe this stuff and how to prescribe this stuff. How do we as coaches encourage this stuff if people are doing it, and how to discourage it if people are doing it too frequently or not using it in a way that's going to benefit training, or using it in a way that's actually detracting from training. So it's just about knowing what these techniques are, where they can be used, where you can derive value from, and hopefully that's enough information to help you out. If you have any questions on this, feel free to hit us up. Always happy to talk. I will catch you next time.